In the early 19th century, the United States was still a young and ambitious nation, eager to assert its power on the world stage. Meanwhile, the British Empire, though weakened by its ongoing war against Napoleon in Europe, still held control over vast territories, including Canada. The War of 1812, often overlooked in history, was an unexpected and dramatic conflict that saw the United States attempt to invade and conquer Canada. However, what seemed like an easy victory for the Americans quickly turned into a disastrous and embarrassing failure. The war ended without any clear winner, but it had profound consequences. The official reason for the War of 1812 was to stop British interference with American trade and impressment of U.S. sailors. The British Royal Navy, desperate for manpower in its fight against Napoleon, had been forcibly conscripting American sailors into service. This enraged many in the U.S., who saw it as an attack on their national sovereignty. But there was another, less publicized reason for the war: territorial expansion. Many American politicians, known as the war hawks, believed that Canada was an easy target. They assumed that the population, many of whom were recent British immigrants, would prefer American rule over British rule. Thomas Jefferson famously predicted that conquering Canada would be a mere matter of marching. This overconfidence would soon prove to be a massive miscalculation. The U.S. planned to invade Canada from three directions: from Detroit, attacking British forces in modern-day Ontario; from Niagara, crossing the river to seize key British forts; from the St. Lawrence River, marching towards Montreal and Quebec to cut off British supply lines. The Americans believed that their larger population, about 7.7 million people versus Canada's 500,000, would give them a decisive advantage. But they underestimated British defenses, the loyalty of many Canadians, and the critical role of Indigenous allies. The first major invasion attempt took place in July 1812, when General William Hull led an American force across the Detroit River into Canada. His troops outnumbered the British defenders nearly 2-1, and success seemed inevitable. But Hull hesitated. He feared that British forces, reinforced by Indigenous warriors led by Tecumseh, would overwhelm him. The British under General Isaac Brock capitalized on this fear. They tricked Hull by making their army appear larger than it actually was and using Indigenous war cries to terrify American troops. The result? Hull panicked and surrendered Detroit without firing a shot. It was one of the most embarrassing defeats in U.S. military history. After the failure in Detroit, the Americans launched another invasion at Queenston Heights in October 1812. This battle saw one of the most famous moments of the war: the death of General Isaac Brock, the charismatic British commander. Despite Brock's death early in the battle, his troops, along with Indigenous warriors led by Tecumseh, repelled the American attack. The defeat shattered American confidence and demonstrated that the war would not be as easy as they had hoped. In April 1813, the Americans finally scored a victory when they captured York, modern-day Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada. They burned the city, looted British government buildings, and destroyed military stockpiles. The British, furious over this act, vowed revenge. 1 year later, in August 1814, they marched into Washington, D.C. and burned the White House, the U.S. Capitol, and other government buildings, a stunning humiliation for the Americans. One of the most important yet often overlooked aspects of the war was the role of Indigenous nations. Many Indigenous groups, particularly those under the leadership of Shawnee leader Tecumseh, sided with the British. Tecumseh understood that if the Americans won, Indigenous lands would be lost forever. He and his warriors fought in several key battles, including the Battle of the Thames in 1813, where he was killed. His death marked the end of Indigenous military resistance in the region and allowed American settlers to expand westward unchecked. Though the land battles were mixed, the Americans had surprising success at sea. The USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, defeated several British warships, proving that the young U.S. Navy could stand up to the most powerful navy in the world. However, Britain blockaded American ports, strangling the U.S. economy and making the war increasingly unpopular among Americans. By late 1814, both sides were exhausted. Britain was more concerned with defeating Napoleon, and the U.S. was struggling to keep fighting. In December 1814, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war without changing any territory. However, just before news of the treaty reached the U.S., the Americans scored a major and unnecessary victory at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. General Andrew Jackson led American forces to a decisive victory, which made him a national hero and later helped him become President of the United States. Although the war officially ended in a stalemate, there were clear consequences. The war solidified Canadian identity and ensured that it would remain British. Many Canadians view the war as their successful defense against American invasion. Though it gained little from the war, Britain successfully defended its North American territory. The young American Navy proved itself against the British, helping establish the U.S. as a naval power. Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans catapulted him to fame, leading to his presidency. On the other hand, the war devastated Indigenous resistance in North America. Without Tecumseh and British support, Indigenous nations were left vulnerable to American expansion. The British blockade crippled American trade, leading to financial struggles. The war hawk's dream of conquering Canada completely failed. The War of 1812 may not have dramatically changed borders, but it shaped the future of North America. It reinforced Canada's connection to Britain, cemented the U.S. as an independent power, and led to the tragic decline of Indigenous resistance. Though often forgotten, this war was a turning point in American, Canadian, and Indigenous history, proving that wars are not always won through size and ambition, but through strategy, resilience, and alliances.